Welcome to this presentation from the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust. The Georgia Commission on the Holocaust is a nonpartisan, secular state agency, and our mission is to provide Holocaust remembrance and education to our constituents, all of those citizens of the state of Georgia. So welcome. Today we're going to look at a presentation on Dr. Seuss, and more specifically, Dr. Seuss Goes to War, Content, Context, and Controversy, the story of Theodor Geisel, Dr. Seuss. How many of us remember reading Green Eggs and Ham, or Horton Hears a Who, or the Lorax? We marveled at the imaginary characters and places, the rhythm and rhyme of the words. So who was Dr. Seuss, Theodor Seuss Geisel, the author of these books for children? And how did he play a role in swaying public opinion during the Holocaust and World War II? Theodor Geisel was a complex character who used his art and writing to express his opinions. In this presentation, we will examine his personal story, his responses to the ideas and events of his time, and the contemporary controversy over some of his work. Theodor Seuss Geisel, a third-generation German-American, was born on March 2, 1904 in Springfield, Massachusetts. At that time, Springfield was home to many prosperous German-American families, many of which, like the Geisels, spoke German at home. His paternal grandparents owned a successful brewery in Springfield, a family business which failed in 1920 with the passage of Prohibition. Geisel attended Springfield's Central High School, where he became involved with the student newspaper, the Central Recorder, for which he wrote articles, verse, humorous short stories, and crafted cartoons. Over time, he became one of the newspaper's editors. In 1921, Theodor Geisel enrolled at Dartmouth College and soon became involved with the student magazine. His involvement with Jack-o'-lantern continued throughout his 4 years at Dartmouth. Famously, however, he was kicked off of the staff when he was found on campus with bootleg liquor. Geisel recalled, quote, "The night before Easter of my senior year, there were 10 of us gathered in my room at the Randall Club. We had a pint of gin for 10 people. So that proves that nobody was really drinking. But Pa Randall, who hated merriment, called the chief of police, and he himself in person raided us. We all had to go before the dean, and we were all put on probation for defying the laws of prohibition, and especially on Easter evening." Geisel was relieved of his duties as editor of the Jack-o'-lantern. But as a workaround, so that he could continue publishing his cartoons in the magazine, he came up with an alias. Thus began his lifelong practice of using his middle name to sign his work, Seuss. After graduation, Geisel spent a year in England at Oxford, and although he found that he didn't like the world of higher education, he did have the opportunity to travel throughout Europe. Another valuable outcome of this year at Oxford was meeting a young woman originally from New Jersey, Helen Palmer. They married in 1927. After his return to the United States, Geisel moved to New York City, where he continued to create his cartoons for various publications. Before Theodor Seuss Geisel found fame as a children's book author, he wrote and illustrated for magazines, including the Saturday Evening Post. His first steady job after he left Oxford was as a cartoonist for Judge, a New York City publication. In 1927, one of these cartoons opened the way to a more profitable career. Geisel's work caught the eye of the wife of an advertising executive working with Standard Oil, and she recommended his work to her husband. The hiring of Geisel inaugurated a 17-year career and a campaign of ads whose recurring plea, "Quick, Henry, the flit," became a common catchphrase. These ads, along with those for several other companies, supported the Geisels throughout the Great Depression and the early period of his writing career. And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street is Theodor Seuss Geisel's first children's book published under the pen name Dr. Seuss. Geisel was 33 years old at the time, and he had 10 years of experience in cartooning, illustrating, and advertising when he began to work on this book on Mulberry Street. First published in 1937, the story follows a boy named Marco, who describes a parade of imaginary people and vehicles traveling along a road, Mulberry Street, in an elaborate fantasy story he dreams up to tell his father at the end of his walk. However, when he arrives home, he decides instead to tell his father what he actually saw: a simple horse and wagon. At least 20 publishers rejected the book before Geisel ran into an old college classmate who had just become juvenile editor at Vanguard Press. Vanguard agreed to publish the book, and it met with high praise from critics upon its release, though sales were not quite as impressive. Later analyses of the book have focused on its connections to Geisel's childhood. The street of the title is probably named after a street in Geisel's hometown of Springfield, Massachusetts. Geisel returned to fictionalized versions of Springfield in later books, and Marco appeared again in 1947 in the Dr. Seuss book, McElligot's Pool. In March 1921, Dr. Seuss Enterprises removed that book from sale. They noted that there were offensive illustrations in the book, negative stereotypes of nationalities and cultures. Remember that the book was created in 1937. So let's look at the history and life of the United States in 1937. So during this period of time, there was segregation. And as you can see from this, there were separate drinking fountains for Black and what were called colored people at the time. This particular photo was taken in Oklahoma. And then this is a photo of Marion Anderson. Marion Anderson could not perform in an indoor concert during that period of time. She was not allowed in the venue. So she actually ended up having to perform at the Lincoln Memorial, which became one of the most famous performances there ever. And at this time, the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was a United States federal law signed by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers. Building on the earlier Page Act of 1875, which banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first and remains the only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. The California Alien Land Law of 1913 prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land or possessing long-term leases over it. But at this time, we also had the German-American Bund. Nearly 1,000 uniformed men wearing swastika armbands and carrying Nazi banners here parade past a reviewing stand in New Jersey. The date of this, July 18th, 1937. Dr. Salvatore Caridi of Union City, a spokesman for a group of Italian-American fascists who were attending as guests, addressed the Bund members as, and I quote, Nazi friends. Again, this is the time period that I think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, and To Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street was printed. War begins, Let's see how Theodor Seuss Geisel responded to the war and America's isolationism. So we start with September 1st, 1939, and the Nazi invasion of Poland. Charles Lindbergh and America First. Charles Augustus Lindbergh was born on February 4th, 1902. He was an American aviator, a military officer, author, inventor, and activist. At the age of 25 in 1927, he made the first solo nonstop flight from New York City to Paris in his single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Charles Lindbergh became a national and worldwide celebrity. His fame helped America First to become a nationwide organization with almost 800,000 members. In 1935, after the kidnapping and murder of their son, Charles Lindbergh and his wife left the United States, landing first in England and then 2 years later to an island off the coast of France. While he was in Europe, Lindbergh was struck by what he saw as positive changes in Germany due to Nazi and Hitler's rule. In 1936, the Lindberghs attended the Nazi Olympics as the special guests of Hermann Goering, the head of the German military air force. Lindbergh was invited to report on Germany's military aviation program. He toured German factories and reviewed newly built planes and German airfields. He grew more and more impressed with the German military and the German people. In October 1938, Lindbergh was presented by Goering on behalf of Hitler with a medal, the Service Cross of the German Eagle. By 1938, news of Nazi persecution of Jews was being covered in the American press. Many Americans were disgusted by photos of Lindbergh wearing his Nazi medals. In 1940, a group of Yale University students founded the America First Committee. They opposed United States intervention in World War II. Many anti-war students joined them, and they were able to recruit Charles Lindbergh to be one of their spokespersons. Lindbergh's speech in Des Moines, Iowa on September 11, 1941 was a turning point for him and for America First. He accused Jews of being war agitators. As a result, the America First Committee lost significant support. The press denounced Lindbergh and the America First Committee for promoting anti-Semitism and intolerance. Political cartoonists, including PM newspaper artist Dr. Seuss, accused Lindbergh of spreading Nazi propaganda. Dr. Seuss's September 18, 1941 cartoon, remember this is just a week after Lindbergh's anti-Semitic statements. This cartoon appeared in PM magazine, and it accused Lindbergh of collaborating with Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels by giving anti-war, anti-Semitic speeches. In this June 2nd, 1941 cartoon, Dr. Seuss criticized the America First Committee for their strong opposition to President Roosevelt rather than opposition to Adolf Hitler. The Wagner-Rogers Bill. In February 1939, Democratic Senator Robert Wagner of New York and Republican Congresswoman Edith Norris Rogers of Massachusetts introduced legislation in Congress to admit 20,000 German refugee children under the age of 14 over a 2-year period. The bill specified that the 10,000 children per year would enter the United States outside of the existing restrictive immigration quota laws. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt backed the Wagner-Rogers bill, and this was the first time that she publicly endorsed any pending legislation while she was First Lady. But despite Mrs. Roosevelt's urging, FDR never officially commented on the proposal to admit refugee children. Senator Robert Reynolds, a Democrat from North Carolina and a vocal opponent of the bill, had recently proposed banning all immigration for 10 years or until the nation solved its unemployment problems during the Depression. His compromise was a 5-year total ban on all immigration in exchange for passing the Child Refugee Bill. This compromise was rejected. The American people, however, agreed with Reynolds. 66% of Americans polled in January 1939 opposed expanding immigration to aid refugee children. The Wagner-Rogers bill never made it to a vote in Congress. And by the way, Anne Frank at that time would have qualified as one of those 20,000 children. In response to the failure of the Wagner-Rogers bill and restrictions on immigration, Dr. Seuss created this shocking October 1st, 1941 cartoon. He lambasted Lindbergh and the America First Committee for being willing to sacrifice children in Europe to the Nazis as a worthwhile trade-off for keeping the United States out of the war. Theodor Geisel worked to shape public opinion about the United States' responsibility to become involved in World War II. Let's see how his opinions evolved over time. So we go back again. September 1st, 1939, World War II begins with the invasion of Poland, and note that at that time, in this opinion poll, it looks as if within the next few months, if England and France might be defeated, should the United States declare war on Germany and send our troops abroad? 48% of Americans said no. On May 10th, 1940, Germany successfully invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And again, do you think the US should declare war on Germany and send our military abroad to fight? 93% of Americans said no. President Franklin Roosevelt was elected to a third term as president in November of 1940. Okay, and here the questions now are starting to change. Now remember, this was also during the time that Great Britain was being relentlessly bombed. What do you think is more important for the US to do? Keep out of war ourselves or help England win? Now public opinion is starting to change. 60% of Americans say we should help. Okay. March 10th, 1941, should we help to arm the Allies? 67% of Americans say yes, and that leads to the Lend-Lease Act. And here's one of Dr. Seuss's cartoons, October 5th, 1941. Seuss makes the case that it's time for the US to join the fight. Now notice the date. This is October 1941. November 1941, the US is on the verge of war. Relations between Japan and the US are deteriorating. How many people say that the US should then come into the war to defeat Germany? Now 68% of Americans. You can see the shift in public opinion. And then we have the cataclysmic event. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Now remember, Hawaii was not yet a state. However, this was one of our military bases. This was considered part of the United States. And now let's look at public opinion about joining the war. On that same date, 91% of Americans say that we should enter the war. Public opinion has changed. But now let's look at what's going to happen after Pearl Harbor and after the US enters World War II. February 19th, 1942. 2 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066. This permits the government to take every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage. Citing national security concerns, the US government used that order to relocate more than 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, at least 2/3 of whom were already American citizens. They were sent to 10 camps across 7 inland states. Now notice the images and the message in this Dr. Seuss cartoon created after Pearl Harbor. Japanese and Japanese Americans, when they were relocated, had to leave behind their businesses, homes, schools, jobs, friends, and also their belongings. And now look at this particular cartoon from 1942. You can see some of the images that are objectionable, but keep in mind what the context is here, okay, which is that the United States is at war with the Axis powers, okay? Here's a public opinion poll on Japanese internment. This is March of 1942. Okay, note the high level of support for the forced internment of Japanese Americans, even those who were born here and were US citizens. So Dr. Seuss's cartoons are reflective of attitudes at the time. Now, we might want to categorize some of those former images as offensive, but now look at this cartoon. This is from 1942, and this is about allowing African Americans to work in America's war industries. And you can see clearly that he supports that. So again, the question is, what is motivating this? What are the feelings in the United States at the time? Context. So Dr. Seuss really goes to war in 1943. At that time, Geisel wanted to participate directly in the war effort. He joined the US Army, but of course he was too old to join a combat unit. So he was put in command of the animation department of the 1st Motion Picture Unit in California. And there he wrote pamphlets, created films, and contributed to the famous Private Snafu cartoon series. So who is Private Snafu? Private Snafu, which stood for Situation Normal, but all fouled up, was a series of adult instructional cartoons. They were humorous and sometimes even raunchy. One of Geisel's most important works was the film Your Job in Germany. It was an orientation film for soldiers who would occupy Germany after the war was over. Geisel, who was German American himself, was assigned to write it a year before the Germans surrendered. In his biography, Geisel said he was sent to Europe during the war to screen the film in front of top generals so he could get their approval. So therefore, he was in Belgium in December of 1944 when it just so happened that the Battle of the Bulge occurred. This was Hitler's last big counteroffensive in Belgium's Ardennes forest. So here he is during this great battle. Geisel said that he was trapped 10 miles behind enemy lines, and it took 3 days before he was rescued by British forces. Dr. Seuss was a prolific writer and had great success with his children's books. His books reveal his views on many social and political issues of the time. So the Lorax from 1971 is about environmentalism and anti-consumerism. The Sneetches from 1961 are about racial equality. The Butter Battle book from 1984 is about the arms race. Yertle the Turtle from 1958 was about Adolf Hitler and anti-authoritarianism. And How the Grinch Stole Christmas from 1957 criticizes the economic materialism and consumerism of the Christmas season. And last, Horton Hears a Who from 1954 is about anti-isolationism and internationalism. I think what we can conclude is that Theodor Geisel was a complex character, and he was very much influenced by the attitudes, events, beliefs of his life and times. Some of his messages and images reinforce negative stereotypes, and for that, we understand the time period it came from. So I leave you with these questions. Is it fair to judge his work through a contemporary lens? Is it important to cease publication of some of these messages and images? Can we separate art and literature from the people who created it? How must we evaluate art and literature as new attitudes, beliefs, and events develop over time? And most importantly, what role does historical context play in our understanding and judgment about the creations of Dr. Seuss? So I leave you with this. This is a story that no one can beat, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. We welcome your questions and comments and look forward to participating in other presentations that we will have in the future. Thank you.